The fields of central Ohio baked under the oppressive, humid weight of a late summer sun. This wasn't a gentle warmth. It was a thick, sweltering heat that smelled of damp earth and rustled the heavy, green leaves of the cornfields. The air itself felt tense, promising a storm. Deep in this lush, isolated landscape, miles from the nearest highway, Alara Vance's weathered farmhouse felt like the only still point in an anxious world. Alara, a young woman whose grace seemed at odds with the heavy title of widow, moved through her kitchen with quiet, economical motions. Her dark hair was pulled back, and her pale blue eyes, usually bright with the creativity that fueled her small floral design studio, were now clouded by a grief that had become a permanent resident in her heart. Her life was quiet, divided between her shop in the nearby town, a vibrant splash of color she called bloom and branch in this secluded house. The house was both her sanctuary and her prison, the last great project she had shared with her husband, Caleb. Caleb, a brilliant and kind logistics engineer, had been gone for 8 months, his life cut short by a sudden, brutal illness that had stolen their future. Now, her only real comfort, the only true sound in the silence, came from the clumsy, chaotic love of Titan and Luna. They were 4-month-old German Shepherd puppies, all oversized paws, needle-sharp teeth, and a boundless, innocent joy. They were Caleb's last gift, arranged weeks before he passed. "To keep you safe," he had whispered. Titan, the larger of the two, was already showing a serious, protective nature, while Luna was a softer, gentler bundle of hesitation and fur. Alara watched them wrestle with a rope toy on the cool slate floor, their tiny, playful growls the only sound breaking the afternoon's oppressive stillness. This was her life, a sad, quiet mosaic built on memory and the needs of 2 growing puppies. A few miles away, where manicured lawns gave way to dusty farm roads and dense woods, that same humid heat was a physical presence against Jax Carter. Jax, a Navy SEAL on a short leave, didn't feel the heat as oppression. He felt it as a challenge, a whetstone against which to sharpen his focus. He was a man made of lean, functional muscle, sharp lines, and cool, assessing blue eyes. He was running, his boots kicking up dust at a punishing pace that would have broken most men miles ago. Beside him, moving in perfect, silent unison, was Ragnar. Ragnar was a 90-pound sable German Shepherd. But he was no pet. He was Jax's K9 partner, a creature of deep intelligence and lethal capability. His senses were alive to the world in ways Jax could only admire. They trained together, fought together, and understood one another in a wordless language of shared intent. Jax was on leave, but for a man like him, leave was simply training without oversight. He ran to stay sharp, but he also ran to outrun ghosts. The last deployment had been messy, a tangle of bad intel and civilian casualties that left a bitter taste in his mouth. The discipline of the run, the burn in his lungs, the silent companionship of Ragnar. This was his church, the only place he could find something like absolution. The heat was just another layer of static to push through, another distraction to conquer. He and Ragnar were a single, focused entity, moving through a harsh landscape, utterly unaware of the quiet life unfolding just over the next rise of farmland. Back at the farmhouse, the puppies had exhausted themselves and were now asleep in a tangled heap at Alara's feet. She sat with a cup of tea, staring out the window at the shimmering heat haze that distorted the endless rows of corn. She was thinking of Caleb, of the plans they'd made. He had loved this landscape, but he'd also been excited by his work at the regional shipping hub, energized by a new project mapping freight routes and container logistics. A faint smile touched her lips. And for a moment, the peace was real, not just an absence of grief. That's when the sound started. The crunch of tires on the gravel drive, slow and heavy, a sound that didn't belong. She never had visitors unannounced. The house was too remote. Alara's heart gave a single, hard thump. She moved to the window, peering around the edge of the curtain. A large, black SUV, its windows tinted to an impossible darkness, was parked on the gravel. It had no license plates. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through her, entirely different from the dull ache of loss. This was fear. The car doors opened. 3 men got out. They were not lost tourists. The first, the apparent leader, was tall and lean, dressed in dark clothes, his eyes cold and empty as he scanned the house. The other 2 were bigger, clearly armed, moving with a predatory confidence that turned her blood to ice. They didn't knock. Alara had just enough time to gasp before the front door exploded inward, the wood of the frame splintering as the lock was kicked from its housing. She stumbled back, a hand flying to her mouth, the teacup shattering on the slate floor. The 2 puppies, jolted awake, began to bark, a chorus of high, frightened yaps. The 3 men filled the doorway. The leader, the one with the cold eyes, stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the room. He registered Alara, taking in her presence with no more interest than a piece of furniture before his eyes moved past her. "Check upstairs," he said, his voice calm, absent of any local accent. The two big men moved past him, their boots heavy on the slate. They weren't burglars. Burglars were frantic, messy. These men were methodical. They began to tear the place apart. They didn't smash. They searched. Drawers were pulled out and emptied. Cushions were ripped from the sofa. Pictures were torn from the walls. They moved with a terrifying, systematic efficiency. Alara stood frozen, her mind screaming. The puppies huddled behind her legs, their barks turning to terrified whimpers. "It's not here," one of the men yelled from the kitchen. The leader turned his flat, merciless gaze back to Alara. He walked toward her, ignoring the cowering woman and the broken tea. He looked around the living room, at the framed photos of her and Caleb, his gaze stopping on a stack of Caleb's logistics journals on a bookshelf. He walked toward them, completely ignoring Alara, who was trembling too hard to stand. Her quiet, sad world had just been ripped open, and the silence of the hot afternoon was replaced by the terrifying sound of her life being systematically unmade. On the ridge, the humid air was a tangible presence, a cloying force that pushed against Jax and Ragnar. It was this air that carried the first sound, thin and sharp, cutting through the drone of cicadas. It was a human scream. Jax stopped, his body instantly alert, his head cocked. Ragnar was already rigid, a statue of sable fur and tense muscle, his ears pitched forward, a low, guttural growl vibrating deep in his chest. This was not the sound of a training exercise. This was not the bark of a coyote or the cry of a hawk. Then a new sound joined it. The high-pitched, desperate yelps of puppies, a sound of pure terror and pain. The switch in Jax's mind was instantaneous. The ghosts of the last mission, the fatigue from the run, the abstract focus of training. It all vanished, burned away by a clean, cold rush of adrenaline. He was no longer a man on leave. He was an operator. He gave a single, soft pat to Ragnar's shoulder. "Watch." Jax moved, not running, but flowing over the uneven ground, using the contours of the land and the tall rows of corn for cover, his boots making no sound. Ragnar moved with him, a dark shadow at his heel, his focus now a palpable, dangerous thing. Inside the house, the air was thick with dust and the new, metallic smell of fear. The two bigger men, thugs who moved with the clumsy confidence of those who rely only on muscle, had finished their initial search. The leader, Marcus, stood in the middle of the living room. He was the real threat. He was a man of average build with the calm, detached eyes of an undertaker, his dark clothes neat despite the heat and chaos. He surveyed the broken door and overturned furniture with a flicker of annoyance, as if his employees had been inefficient. He turned his attention to Alara, who was now bound to a dining chair with a zip tie pulled painfully tight around her wrists. "This has been a waste of my time," Marcus said, his voice low, almost polite. He crouched, bringing his face level with hers. "Your husband, Caleb, the logistics engineer. He had taken something, a small, black hard drive. It wasn't his. It belonged to very, very serious people. I'm here to collect it." Alara's mind, foggy with terror, struggled to catch up. "What? Caleb? No, I don't know what you're talking about. He's gone." Marcus sighed. A sound of practiced patience. "Yes, he's gone, which means he left it here." "Where?" "I don't know. I swear I don't know." Alara's voice broke, tears of terror and confusion streaking her face. The puppies, Titan and Luna, were barking frantically from the kitchen, trapped behind a baby gate Caleb had installed. Marcus's cold eyes flickered toward the sound. "This isn't a negotiation," he said. He nodded to the larger of his henchmen, a brute with a heavy jaw and knuckles like stones. "Rocco, make her understand." Rocco grinned, a cruel, simple smile. He walked past Alara and into the kitchen. The barking changed to a single, sharp, agonizing yelp. Alara screamed, "No, please stop. They're just puppies." Rocco emerged, dragging both whimpering puppies by the scruffs of their necks. He threw them onto the slate floor in the middle of the room. Luna huddled in a trembling ball, but Titan, despite his own fear, managed to get to his feet, letting out a tiny, defiant growl. "Where is the hard drive?" Marcus asked again, his voice perfectly even. "I don't know," Alara screamed, struggling against the zip ties. "Please." Rocco picked up a piece of the broken dining chair, a heavy leg of solid oak. "This one's got some fight in him," he sneered, looking at Titan. He raised the piece of wood. Outside, Jax had reached the house. He was crouched low, concealed by a large planter next to the living room window. He could see everything. He saw the woman, Alara, tied to the chair, her face a mask of horror. He saw the calm, snake-like leader, Marcus. He saw the second henchman, a younger, nervous-looking kid, standing guard at the broken doorway. And he saw Rocco, the brute, raising the oak club. Just as he processed the scene, he heard Marcus's voice clearly through the open window. The logistics engineer, he took something, a small, black hard drive. The words hit Jax with the force of a punch. Logistics engineer, hard drive, cartel. This wasn't a robbery. This was a cartel cleanup operation on American soil. This woman wasn't a random victim. She was a target. He saw Rocco's arm tense, saw the wood swing down, heard the sickening thump as it connected with Titan's ribs. The puppy cried out, a sound that was cut short. Alara became hysterical, a raw, wordless scream of agony tearing from her throat. Stop. I'll look. I'll look. Just stop. Rocco laughed and raised the club again, aiming for the puppy's head. One more for good measure, he said. Jax had seen enough. He had heard enough. His mind was a cold, clear space. Every action pre-planned, he made a low, sharp clicking sound. Ragnar, who had been vibrating with contained energy beside him, locked eyes with him. Jax gave a short, forward hand signal. Go. It was the only command needed. Ragnar didn't hesitate. He was a 90-pound missile of pure, trained aggression. He launched himself from the ground, covering the 10 feet to the window in a single bound. He hit the plate glass with the full force of his body. The glass didn't shatter. It exploded inward in a shower of crystal. Ragnar felt no impact. He was already airborne, his target acquired. Before Rocco could even process the sound, Ragnar's jaws clamped down on the man's arm, the one holding the club, with over 1,000 pounds of pressure. The sound of the bone snapping was lost in Rocco's high-pitched, inhuman scream. The instant the glass broke, Jax moved. He was a blur of motion, rising from cover and storming through the already broken front door. The second henchman, the nervous one, turned, fumbling for the pistol at his waistband. He was too slow. Jax's left hand clamped down on his, pinning the weapon in its holster while his right elbow slammed into the man's temple. The man collapsed, unconscious before he hit the floor. Marcus, the leader, was fast. He saw the dog, saw Jax, and drew his own weapon, but he focused on Jax, the obvious threat. He didn't see Ragnar release the screaming Rocco and re-engage. Following his training, Ragnar drove into Marcus's hip, taking him off balance. The leader's shot went wide, punching a hole in the ceiling. It was the only shot he would fire. Jax closed the distance in a single step, his hand chopping at the leader's wrist, sending the gun skittering across the slate. A rapid series of precise strikes to the throat and solar plexus took the man's breath and will, and he crumpled, gagging. The entire brutal dance of violence was over in less than 5 seconds. The abrupt silence that filled the room was deafening, broken only by Alara's terrified, hitching gasps, the puppy's pained whimpers, and the low, warning growl of Ragnar, now standing unharmed over the two conscious but incapacitated men. Jax Carter, his chest not even heaving, turned his cold blue eyes to the woman tied in the chair. The world was a screaming vortex of shattered glass, dust, and the sharp, metallic tang of spent cordite. The only still point was Jax, and the only sound that mattered was the low, controlled growl from Ragnar, standing guard over 3 incapacitated men. 2 were moaning, the brute Rocco cradling his shattered arm, the leader, Marcus, gagging for breath. The third was silent, unconscious. Alara was still tied to the chair, her breaths coming in short, high, thin gasps, her eyes wide and blank, fixed on the impossible violence that had just unfolded in her living room. Jax moved, his body a fluid, economical machine. He ignored the men. His first priority had been the threat. His second was the victim. He drew a tactical knife from a sheath on his belt and crossed to Alara in 2 strides. He didn't speak. He simply sliced through the plastic tie binding her wrists. The moment the restraint was cut, life flooded back into Alara's frozen limbs. She didn't thank him. She didn't look at him. She fell from the chair, scrambling on her hands and knees across the floor, heedless of the glass shards and debris. No, 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 she moaned, a desperate, broken prayer. She reached the 2 small, still forms. She touched Luna first. The female puppy was limp, her fur soft, but lifeless. Alara made a sound that wasn't a scream, but a deep, hollow cry of such profound agony it seemed to suck the air from the room. She gathered the tiny body to her, her own body shaking, her mind fractured. Then a small, weak sound cut through her grief. A cough. Titan. He was alive, just barely. His small side was matted with blood from a deep gash, and his breathing was shallow, his eyes fluttering. Titan, Alara choked out, her hand hovering over him, afraid to touch. Jax had already turned away. He was a man of sequential priorities. Threat neutralized. Victim freed. Now, scene control. He pulled a satellite phone from his pack, his personal phone, untraceable, always secure. He dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was tinny. 911, what's your emergency? Jax's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. I am at 1448 Vista Ridge Trail. I've been involved in a self-defense shooting. 3 armed intruders, neutralized, but alive. I require police and EMS immediately. Sir, are you injured? Negative. There is 1 female civilian, unharmed but in severe shock. Send an ambulance. He ended the call. He didn't wait for questions. He immediately dialed a second number, one he knew by heart. It rang twice. Cole. The voice on the other end was gruff, alert. It was Agent Ethan Cole, Jax's former teammate, now a field agent for the FBI's Columbus office. Ethan, it's Jax. Jax? What's going on? You're on leave. I'm at 1448 Vista Ridge Trail, Delaware County. I've just neutralized 3 cartel hostiles. They were in a civilian residence. Torturing the occupant. Cartel? Are you sure? Affirmative, Jax said, his eyes scanning the room. They were looking for a hard drive belonging to the civilian's deceased husband. He was a logistics engineer. This is your world, Ethan, not local PD. You need to take over this scene. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Ethan, a man with prematurely gray hair and the weary eyes of a career investigator, understood the implications instantly. A logistics engineer, Caleb Vance. Didn't get his name, but that's what they said. I'm on my way, Ethan said, his voice now grim. Don't let the local cops touch anything. Keep the woman secure. And Jax, try not to break any more laws. The line went dead. Jax secured the intruders' weapons, then used their own belts and his spare zip ties to bind them properly. The distant wail of sirens grew closer, a sound that for the first time in Alara's life, represented not safety, but a further violation. The first car to arrive was a single patrol cruiser that skidded to a halt on the gravel, its lights painting the room in frantic, strobing flashes of red and blue. A young uniformed deputy, his name tag reading Miller, stepped out, hand on his holstered weapon. Deputy Miller, a sharp, by-the-book man in his late 20s, had nothing in his training that had prepared him for the scene before him. He saw 3 men, clearly cartel members, zip-tied on the floor. He saw one man, Jax, who looked less like a victim and more like a predator, covered in dust and blood with an unregulation, military-grade K9 standing over the prisoners. And he saw Alara, a hysterical woman kneeling on the floor, covered in broken glass, cradling one dead puppy and hovering over another that was bleeding to death. Police, show me your hands. Step away from the weapons, Miller yelled, his voice cracking slightly. Jax slowly raised his hands. My name is Jackson Carter. I'm active duty Navy. The weapons are secured. The intruders are subdued. The civilian, he nodded toward Alara, is in shock. Medics rushed in behind Miller, their bags clattering. They saw the 3 men, their primary patients, and began to work. Miller, overwhelmed, tried to take control. Sir, I need you to step outside, and the dog. The dog stays, Jax said, his voice low and absolute. He's secure. Ma'am. A paramedic, a kind-faced woman named Hannah, approached Alara. Ma'am, we need to check you out. Let's get you out of here. She reached for Alara. No. Alara screamed, recoiling. Him. You have to save him. He's bleeding. Hannah glanced at the dog. Ma'am, it's a dog. We have human patients. He's dying. Please. Alara's plea was so raw it cut through the chaos. She was in shock, clinging to the only living thing she had left. Jax saw the hesitation. The puppy was fading. He knew that wound. It was an arterial bleed. The puppy had minutes. He made a decision. He pushed past the flustered deputy. She's in shock, he said to Hannah. The dog is the only thing keeping her grounded. If she loses him, she's gone. He unslung the small pack he'd been wearing on his run. It was a tactical medical kit. Ragnar, watch. Ragnar moved instantly, placing himself between Jax and Alara and the cluster of confused cops. He didn't growl. He was just a 90-pound wall. Jax knelt in the broken glass, ignoring the deputy's protests. Alara, he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. I can stop the bleeding, but you have to hold him. Hold him still. His voice, calm and certain, cut through her panic. She nodded, her hands trembling. Jax's hands, steady and practiced, pulled out a packet of combat gauze. He found the wound, a deep, ugly tear. He locked eyes with Alara. This is going to hurt him. Hold him. He packed the gauze into the wound, applying direct, forceful pressure. The puppy yelped, a weak, thin sound, and Alara sobbed, but she held on, her tears falling onto Jax's hands as he worked, a silent, surreal baptism in the wreckage. The arrival of the black sedans marked the end of the chaos and the beginning of cold, methodical federal intervention. The sirens of the local cruisers were replaced by the quiet hum of government vehicles. The new arrivals, men and women in dark suits and FBI windbreakers, moved with a quiet, coordinated purpose that made Deputy Miller and his colleagues look like amateurs. They cordoned off the road, redirected the ambulance carrying the intruders, now federal prisoners, and managed the local police with a polite but ironclad authority. Leading them was Agent Ethan Cole. Ethan was a man in his late 40s with the sharp suit of a federal agent, but the tired, cynical eyes of a man who had seen too much. He was tall with prematurely graying hair, and he moved like the operator he used to be, a former Force Recon Marine. He was one of the few men Jax trusted. Ethan found Jax right where he'd left him, kneeling in the broken glass, his hands still dark with blood, Ragnar a silent statue at his side. Alara was nearby, clutching the bleeding, gauze-wrapped form of Titan, her knuckles white. She was shivering with shock, covered in a fine layer of dust and glass. Ethan took in the scene. Jax, the K9, the catatonic civilian, the dead puppy, Luna, now respectfully covered with a blanket by a paramedic, and the tactical med kit. Jax, Ethan said, his voice a low growl. You're on leave for 1 week. 1. And you start a war with the Juarez cartel on domestic soil. You've got a talent. Jax didn't stand. He looked up at his friend. They were torturing her, Ethan. They killed 1 dog. They were about to kill this one. I know, Ethan said, his eyes softening as he looked at Alara. He crouched down. Ms. Vance, I'm Agent Cole. We're here to help. Alara didn't respond. She just stared at the small, breathing bundle in her arms. The dog needs a vet, Ethan. Now, Jax said, his voice a command. It's not going to make it to a city ER. Ethan nodded, understanding. He spoke into his radio. Get me a priority channel to Dr. Albright. Tell her it's a federal request. I need her surgical unit on standby. Secure an escort. He looked back at Jax. We'll get him to the best, but you and Ms. Vance are coming with me. This house is a tomb. An FBI-funded animal ambulance, normally reserved for high-value K9s, arrived minutes later. Alara refused to let Titan go. In the end, it was Jax who broke the stalemate. He spoke to Alara, his voice low. I'll go with him. I won't leave his side. But you have to go with Agent Cole. They'll keep you safe until I get back. It was the first promise he'd made her. Alara looked at him, her eyes searching his face, and finally, numbly, she nodded. She was handed off to a female agent while Jax and Ragnar climbed into the transport with the dying puppy. The next few hours were a sterile, white blur. Titan was rushed into emergency surgery. Dr. Albright, a sharp, no-nonsense veterinary surgeon, confirmed Jax's fears. A punctured lung and a ruptured spleen. The puppy's chances were slim. Jax and Ragnar waited in a sterile hallway, the smell of antiseptic burning Jax's nose. He hated hospitals. Meanwhile, Alara was taken to a tall, anonymous building in downtown Columbus. It was an FBI safe house, a place that smelled of industrial cleaner and stale air, a beige box designed to be forgotten. Ethan sat across from her at a cheap laminate table, offering a coffee she didn't touch. Alara, he began, his voice gentle but firm. What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult. He laid it all out. Her husband, Caleb Vance, was a brilliant logistics engineer. The FBI now believed he had accidentally discovered and copied data from the shipping hub's main server. It wasn't just cargo manifests. It was a ghost ledger. Smuggling routes, bribe lists, and the names of corrupt officials, all run by the same cartel Jax had just encountered. We believe he put that data on a single, encrypted hard drive, Ethan said. We think he told someone and the cartel found out. They weren't there to rob you, Alara. They were there to get that drive back and to silence you. Alara's world, already shattered, broke into a million pieces. No, she whispered. Caleb wasn't a criminal. He wasn't. We don't think he was, Ethan interrupted gently. We think he was a good man who saw something wrong and didn't know how to report it. He was a patriot, but that knowledge made you a target. And now you are the only living person they believe knows where that drive is.
I don't know, she whispered, the tears finally coming, hot and agonizing.
I don't know anything. I believe you, Ethan said. But they don't. Just then, Ethan's phone buzzed. He read the text. Good news. Your dog, Titan, he's out of surgery. It's touch and go, but he's alive. Jax is with him. Jax returned 2 hours later, his clothes still dirty, Ragnar at his heels. He found Ethan in the hallway outside Alara's assigned room. He's stable, Jax reported. Vet says he's a fighter, but she isn't. She's in catastrophic shock, Ethan said, rubbing his eyes. She won't talk to my trauma counselor. She won't eat. She just sits and stares at the wall. She's broken, Jax. And I need what's in her head. I need to find that drive. So, what's the plan? The plan is that she trusts you. You're the only one who got a human response out of her. You saved her. You saved her dog. In her mind, you're the only thing that's real. I'm not a therapist, Ethan. No, Ethan said, placing a hand on Jax's shoulder. You're not. You're a SEAL on leave, which makes this a very awkward request. Your CO has been briefed on the situation. The Navy is loaning you to us. You are officially assigned as tactical liaison and protection detail for this witness. You and Ragnar, you're staying. Jax's eyes hardened. He was a man of action, of movement. A sterile apartment was a cage. But he thought of Alara's eyes, the empty void where a person used to be. Affirmative, he said. That night, the adrenaline finally receded, and the true horror settled in. Alara's mind, no longer buffered by shock, replayed the day's events in a vicious, relentless loop. The splintering door, the men's voices, the smell of cordite, the sound of the club hitting Titan, the lifelessness of Luna in her arms. She woke with a strangled scream, her hands clawing at her throat, the sheets tangled around her. The room was dark, unfamiliar. She was suffocating. She scrambled out of bed, heart hammering, and stumbled into the common area. The apartment was dark, silent, and then she saw him. In the far corner of the kitchen, lit only by the faint, cold city light through the window, Jax was sitting at the table. He wasn't sleeping. He was perfectly still. In front of him on a protective mat were the disassembled pieces of his sidearm. He was meticulously cleaning them, his large hands moving with an almost surgical precision, wiping down each component with an oiled cloth. The quiet, rhythmic click and slide of metal on metal was the only sound. Alara froze, her breath catching. The sight of him, a man of such profound violence, sitting in the dark, tending to his weapon. It should have been terrifying. It should have sent her running back to her room. But it didn't, because he was awake. He was on watch. He was the wall between her and the nightmares. He looked up, his movements never faltering. His cool blue eyes met hers in the dark. He didn't ask, "Are you okay?" He didn't ask, "Did you have a nightmare?" He didn't state the obvious. He simply paused his work, stood, went to the counter, and filled a kettle. He took out a mug and a tea bag. He said nothing until the water was boiled and the tea was steeped. "This will help," he said, his voice a low rumble in the silence. He pushed the mug across the table toward her. Alara's hands trembled as she took it. She sat down at the opposite end of the table. Jax sat back down and resumed his work. The quiet, rhythmic clicking started again. They sat there for an hour in the dark in complete silence while a 90-pound war dog slept at the foot of the door. And for the first time that day, Alara's heart stopped trying to hammer its way out of her chest. The silence of that first night bled into the sterile rhythm of the days that followed. The safe house was a high-rise apartment in a featureless glass tower, a beige box designed to be invisible. It had no personality, no smell of home. It smelled of new carpet and industrial-grade cleaner. For Alara, it was a sensory deprivation tank that left her with nothing but her own looping thoughts. Splintering wood, Luna's cry, the cold, dead eyes of Marcus. Time became elastic, measured only by the changing light that crawled across the beige walls and the brief, structured intrusions from the outside world. Agent Ethan Cole would visit each morning, his presence an awkward mix of cynical friend and driven federal officer. He would ask Alara the same questions, gently, persistently trying to jog her memory. Did Caleb mention any new friends? Any strange meetings? Did he ever use a thumb drive that wasn't for work? A hard drive? And every day Alara would give the same whispered answer. I don't know. I don't know. Ethan never pushed too hard. He would sigh, nod to Jax, and leave. The rest of the day was a study in confinement defined by the two males in her life. One was Ragnar, a silent, disciplined shadow who lay by the apartment door, his head always up, his ears always swiveling, a living security system. The other was Jax. Jax made no attempt to comfort her. He didn't ask how she was feeling or tell her it was going to be okay. Instead, he simply existed, a solid, uncompromising presence. He made coffee, dark and strong, and left a mug on the counter for her each morning. He checked the apartment's perimeter every hour, his movements becoming so familiar she stopped noticing them. He would speak to Ragnar in low, soft German, his voice, so flat in English, becoming almost melodic as he praised his companion. And he never seemed to sleep. He would sit in the armchair facing the door, a book open on his lap, but his eyes were always scanning, his body always ready. He slept, Alara realized, the way he trained. In short, controlled bursts, never allowing himself to fully submerge, always ready. On the third day, the beige silence was broken. Ethan arrived, but not alone. He was followed by two agents carrying a large dog crate. Alara's heart leapt into her throat. We decided, Ethan said, trying for casualness, that witness and asset morale would be better if he were here. The agents opened the crate and Titan, skinny, partially shaved with a heavy bandage around his chest, stumbled out. He looked weak, confused, and frightened. He whimpered, searching for Luna. Alara sank to her knees, the first real sob since that day tearing from her chest. She wrapped her arms around the puppy's neck, and he buried his head in her lap. He's recovering, Ethan said softly. But the vet said he needs physical therapy twice a day or the muscles on that side will seize up. Jax, he said, you know the protocols. And with that, the routine changed. Jax was no longer just a guard. He became a reluctant teacher. You have to do it, he told Alara that afternoon, his voice allowing for no argument. He needs to associate you with recovery, not just pain. His knowledge was not that of a simple dog lover. It was professional. I'm the team medic, he explained briefly when she looked at him, confused. For the dogs and the men, the principles are the same. He showed her how to gently massage the puppy's leg to keep the blood flowing. He showed her range of motion exercises, his own large, calloused hands moving with a surprising, delicate precision. No, he corrected her, his hand covering hers. Softer. You're fighting the muscle. You need to persuade it. Alara stared at their hands, together on the puppy's fur. His hands were weapons. She had seen what they could do. They were scarred, the knuckles slightly flattened, the veins prominent, yet the pressure they exerted now was as gentle as a whisper. It was the first time she had voluntarily touched him, and she was startled by the warmth of his skin. She began to see the man behind the soldier. She saw the meticulous way he cared for Ragnar, checking his paws for irritation from the carpet, grooming him, sharing his own rations with the dog as a reward. She saw him late at night, standing by the large window, not looking at the city lights, but scanning the rooftops and windows of the opposing buildings, his focus absolute. He was a man perpetually at war, a living shield. He was nothing like Caleb, who had been all soft smiles, warm sweaters, and intellectual passion. Jax was hard angles, cold observation, and lethal potential. And yet, for the first time in months, Alara felt a novel sensation. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't peace. It was simply safe. It was during one of their sessions with Titan, perhaps a week into their confinement, that the moment came. They were sitting on the floor side by side. Titan, growing stronger every day, had finally drifted off to sleep with a contented sigh, his head in Alara's lap. Jax was demonstrating how to check the tension in the puppy's shoulder to ensure the bandage wasn't causing atrophy. His sleeve was pushed up, revealing his forearm. The light from the window caught it, highlighting a scar she had only glimpsed before. It was not a clean surgical line. It was a puckered, discolored field of keloid tissue, a starburst of damage that started at his wrist and disappeared under his sleeve. It was the kind of scar shrapnel makes, from something hot, fast, and meant to kill. Alara's hand, which had been stroking Titan, paused. She stared at it. She didn't mean to, but her fingers left the puppy's fur and gently, almost without contact, traced the raised edge of the scar. Jax went perfectly still, his muscles tightening, his entire body locking down. It was the first time she had initiated contact. He didn't pull his arm away, but his eyes, when they met hers, were guarded and 1,000 miles away. "What?" Alara whispered, her voice barely audible. "What happened?" Jax's jaw tightened. He looked from her face, to her hand on his arm, and then back to her face. He was a man who lived in a world of actions, not words. He didn't know how to explain. He took a breath. "Afghanistan," he said. The word hung in the air, heavy and cold. A high-value target recovery. We were moving to the exfil point. Eyed. The man in front of me. He stepped on it. Jax's eyes were no longer in the room. He was back in the dust and smoke. "I got lucky. Just fragmentation. Shrapnel." He paused, his voice going flat and empty. "Two of my team didn't." The silence that followed was different from the silence of the night. This was a shared, heavy presence. Alara finally understood. She understood the vigilance, the lack of sleep, the cold, scanning eyes. It wasn't heartlessness. It was a shield. It was the armor of a man who had watched the world explode and was spending the rest of his life waiting for it to happen again. Her own grief, which had felt so singular and isolating, suddenly felt shared. He had lost his brothers. She had lost her husband. They were both survivors of different kinds of explosions. Slowly, deliberately, she did not remove her hand. Instead, she let her fingers rest on the scar, a gesture of silent, profound understanding. "I lost someone, too," she whispered. Jax met her gaze, and for the first time, the cold, assessing blue of his eyes softened for just a moment. And he saw her. He didn't just see a witness to be protected. He saw a fellow survivor, and he nodded. The scar on Jax's arm became a map of the new territory between them. The days in the safe house, which had begun with the sterile, jarring silence of strangers bound by trauma, shifted. The silence was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was a shared quiet, a space where two people who had lost their anchors in the world could simply exist without the exhausting pretense of words. Alara found herself breathing slower when Jax was in the room. He was still a coiled spring, a man of profound and unsettling stillness. But he was her stillness. He was the wall, the guardian, the man who cleaned his weapon in the dark. He was the certainty that the nightmares, though they might come, could not cross the threshold. Their routine was simple. Jax would wake her before dawn. "Perimeter check," he would say, and they would walk Titan, now strong enough for short, careful laps, on the building's secure rooftop terrace. They would move in the cold, gray pre-dawn haze, Jax and Ragnar scanning the opposing rooftops, Alara and Titan breathing the air of a world that seemed 1,000,000 miles away. Then they would return, and Jax would train. A brutal, relentless workout in the apartment's small gym while Alara and Titan did their own physical therapy. The puppy was recovering, his limp fading, his spirit returning. He was the living bridge between them. He would leave Alara to go and rest his head on Jax's boot, and Jax, without pausing in his reps, would reach down and scratch the dog's ears. Alara watched this interaction, feeling a fragile spark of hope. It wasn't happiness, but it was miles from the despair that had consumed her. She was learning to read Jax, to see the minute shifts in his posture, to understand the difference between his alert silence and his resting silence. He was, she realized, the most honest man she had ever met. He offered no false comforts. On the 9th day, the new rhythm was broken. Ethan Cole arrived, and this time he was not alone. He was flanked by 2 other agents in dark suits, and his face, normally a mask of tired, cynical humor, was set in grim lines. He was no longer Ethan the friend. He was Agent Cole the hunter. "Alara, Jax," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "We have a situation." He opened a file on the laminate table. It was filled with surveillance photos. "The cartel," Ethan continued, "is imploding. Your little stunt at the house, Jax, decapitated their local distribution. But it's the why that matters. We were right. Caleb's drive." He slid a photo across the table. It was a grainy shot of a man in a suit shaking hands with someone at the Columbus shipping hub. "This is Director Richard Sterling, head of the Port Authority. We believe he's who Marcus and his crew reported to. The data on that drive doesn't just prove smuggling. It proves state-level corruption. It's the whole kingdom." Alara stared at the photo. Richard Sterling. Caleb. Caleb had dinner with him last year. He said Sterling was intense. "Sterling is desperate," Ethan said. "We've been monitoring his encrypted traffic. He's bringing in a new team, professionals, to find that drive. He's not trying to clean up a mess anymore, Alara. He's trying to save his own life, and he is convinced you either have the drive or know where it is." Jax, who had been standing by the window, turned. Ragnar, sensing the shift in the room, rose from his spot by the door. Then it's done, Jax said, his voice flat. Wait sec. We move her today. Ethan looked down at his hands. That's an option, but it's not the best one. If we move her, Sterling and the cartel just go to ground. The threat never ends. She spends the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. The port stays corrupt. We want to end this. All of it. A new, cold fear twisted in Alara's stomach. What are you proposing? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. We're proposing a trade, Ethan said, his eyes meeting hers. Sterling is looking for the drive. We're going to let him find it. We've authenticated a back channel. We'll send a message from you offering to sell the drive for $5 million and a clean passport. The silence that followed was absolute. Jax was the first to move. No. The word was not a suggestion. It was an order. An iron wall. Absolutely not. You are not using her as bait. Jax, listen to me. No, you listen, Jax said, stepping forward. Ragnar moved with him, a low growl starting in his chest. She's a noncombatant. She's a civilian victim who has been through a catastrophic psychological trauma. She is not an asset. She is not a field agent, and you are not going to dangle her in front of the people who just tried to kill her. It's not happening. I'll call my CO right now. I'll pull out of this whole arrangement. You put her in protective custody or I will. Ethan stood, his own frustration rising. And then what? She spends the rest of her life in Nebraska checking under her car. That's not a life. This is the only way to cut the head off the snake. We'll have her wired, Jax. A dozen agents. She won't be in any real danger. They killed my dog. The voice was quiet, ice cold, and it stopped both men in their tracks. Alara was standing, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white. Jax and Ethan stared at her. She was trembling, but it was no longer with fear. It was with a cold, clear rage. They came into my home, she said, her voice stronger, locking onto Ethan. They tied me up. They killed Luna. They almost killed him. She gestured to Titan, now awake, watching the tension in the room. They did that because of Caleb. Because he was a good man who saw something wrong. She took a breath, the first real, deep breath she'd taken in days. I am tired of hiding. I am tired of being afraid. I am not going to Nebraska. She turned to Jax, her eyes pleading, but her jaw set. This was my life, my husband, my home. They took it. I want it back. Jax looked at her, his mind at war with itself. He saw the woman in the chair, hysterical and broken, and he saw the woman before him now, her spine made of steel, her grief forged into a weapon. He saw the bravery of the civilian, but underneath it, he saw something he recognized. Resolve. Alara, he said, his voice softer. You don't know what you're asking. This isn't a movie. This is real. You think I don't know that? She snapped. I was there. I was the one who heard them. I was the one who held my dead dog. This is the only way it ends. You said it yourself, Ethan. I want to end it. Ethan looked at Jax. Jax stood for a long moment. He had lost the argument. He ran a hand over his face, a rare sign of frustration. He turned his back to them for a second, looking out the window, and when he turned back, the man was gone. The seal was back. All right, Jax said. His voice was now devoid of emotion. It was cold, flat, and operational. If we do this, we're not doing it your way. We're doing it my way. Ethan raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. No parks, no open spaces, no cars, too many variables. Jax pointed to the middle of the table. The Columbus Metropolitan Library, downtown branch. Metal detectors at the main entrance, which means they'll come unarmed or be forced to use a secondary entrance, which we will control. We'll make the exchange on the third floor in the rare books archive. It's a glass room, soundproofed with a single point of entry. My team controls the door. Your team? Ethan asked. Ragnar and me, Jax said. You can have your agents in the stacks, on the street, on the rooftops. I don't care. But inside that room, it's me, her, and the target. That's the only way I'll agree to this. I'll be the one at her side. I'll be the one to clear the room. Ethan Wyatt looked at the cold, lethal certainty in Jax's eyes. He knew that look. This was not a request. You'll be in disguise, Ethan said, already beginning to compromise. You'll be a library staffer, a special collections expert. I don't care what you call me, Jax said. He turned to Alara. The fragile warmth of the past week was gone, replaced by the ice of command. The meet is in 2 days. Between now and then, you don't sleep. You don't eat. You train with me. You will do exactly what I say when I say it. You will not speak. You will not hesitate. Am I clear? Alara looked at the hard stranger before her. She was terrified, and she was ready. Clear, she whispered. The Columbus Metropolitan Library was a modern marvel of glass and steel, a place of echoing silence and studious purpose. But on this Tuesday, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was a taut wire, vibrating with an unseen tension. The air conditioning was too cold, raising goosebumps on Alara's arms, and the smell of old paper and floor wax did nothing to soothe the frantic drumming in her chest. She wore a simple gray dress, a wire, an earpiece in one ear, the small, hard package of the fake hard drive in her purse. In her ear, Ethan Cole's voice was a low, tinny whisper. Team is in position. All exits are covered. We have eyes on the main floor. You are a go. Stick to the plan. Alara's hand tightened on her purse. She was the bait, and she was terrified. You are not the bait. You are the hunter. Jax's voice, spoken 2 hours earlier in the back of the armored van, echoed in her head. He had been a different man. The past 48 hours had been a blur of relentless, exhausting training. He had drilled her, evasive movement, situational awareness, how to fall, how to signal, how to think under pressure. He had deconstructed her fear and rebuilt it into a cold, hard resolve. Now he was nowhere to be seen, and that was the plan. The meet was on the 3rd floor in the glass-walled room of the Rare Books Archive. Alara stepped out of the elevator, her steps feeling heavy. The 3rd floor was quiet. An FBI agent disguised as a student sat at a study carrel. Another, a woman, browsed the history section. They were invisible, but they were there. Alara pushed open the heavy wooden door of the archive. The room was exactly as Jax had described, a glass box with one door, filled with old maps and leather-bound books, and sitting at the main desk, arranging a stack of folders, was a man in a tweed jacket and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked up, the slightly annoyed expression of a scholar. "Can I help you?" he asked. It was Jax. The transformation was so complete it took Alara's breath away. He had no visible weapon. His hair was slightly mussed. He looked like an overworked historian, not a Navy SEAL. He was perfect.
I have a 2 o'clock, Alara said, her voice having just the right amount of tremor.
Special collections? Of course, Jax said, his voice even. He gestured to the table. Please have a seat. He moved to the door and locked it from the inside, a standard security procedure for handling rare documents. Then he did something that was not procedure. He hit a small, unseen switch under the desk. A do not disturb sign on the door's digital display glowed red. He had just locked them in. He turned back and in his eyes, Alara saw cold, operational focus. Ragnar was nowhere to be seen. He was, as Jax had promised, under the custom-built archivist's desk, in a downstay, a silent 90-pound weapon waiting for a single word. The minutes ticked by. 2:03 p.m. Alara's heart seized. He's late, she whispered. He's not late, Jax said, not looking up from his folders. He's testing. He's watching. At 2:05 p.m., the door handle jiggled. Then a key card swiped. The lock clicked open. Jax looked up. His face, a mask of academic confusion. That's odd. The door opened. A man in a sharp, $1,000 suit walked in. This was not a thug. This was a lawyer. He was in his late 50s with slicked back gray hair and a nervous tick at the corner of his eye. Ms. Vance? He asked, his briefcase clutched in his hand. I'm Mr. Finch. I'm here on behalf of an interested party. He's clean, Ethan, Jax murmured, too low for the man to hear. Ethan's voice in Alara's ear. We see him, Alara. He's just the bagman. Play the part. Do you have it? Finch asked, his eyes darting around the glass room. Do you have the item? Alara nodded, her hands trembling as she pulled the dummy drive from her purse. She placed it on the table. Finch's eyes lit up. He reached for his briefcase, but before he could open it, a second sound came from behind him. A heavy click. It was the sound of the archive staff-only fire escape door opening. A door the FBI had secured. A door that was not supposed to open. Ethan, Jax said, his voice dropping. We have a breach. Staff entrance. What? That's impossible. Ethan's voice in Alara's ear dissolved into static. A man stepped out of the shadows of the staff hallway. He was not in a suit. He wore expensive casual clothes, and he moved with a fluid, predatory grace. He was in his 40s with the calm, handsome face of a CEO, but his eyes were the eyes of a shark, cold, black, and dead. This wasn't Sterling. This wasn't the bagman. This was the professional Sterling had called in. This was the ghost. "Thank you for confirming the package, Mr. Finch," the ghost said, his voice a smooth baritone. "You are a fool." He didn't even look at Finch. His eyes were locked on Jack's. The ghost had not been fooled by the tweed jacket. He was a professional, and he recognized another professional. He saw the way Jax's hands were resting just a little too casually on the desk. He saw the set of his shoulders. Before the FBI agents in the stacks could even register the new target, the ghost moved. He was impossibly fast. He ignored Finch, rounded the table, and seized Alara, yanking her from her chair. An arm locked around her throat, cutting off her air, and the cold, hard circle of a pistol muzzle pressed against her temple. Her earpiece was ripped out, clattering to the floor. "Don't move." The ghost hissed, his body a shield, using Alara as armor. The bagman, Finch, screamed, and dived under the table. Jax was on his feet, his hands up, the librarian disguise gone, the seal fully present. "Ethan, we are compromised." "Hostage situation," Jax yelled for the mics to pick up. "I don't think Ethan can hear you," the ghost sneered. He recognized the man before him. You were at the house. The K9. You're the seal." He laughed, a short, sharp sound. "They send a soldier to do a cop's job, and they fail." "Let her go," Jax said, his voice low, deadly. "She's a civilian. She's no use to you." "She is the only reason you are not dead," the ghost replied. He pressed the gun harder into Alara's skin. She whimpered, her nails scratching at his arm. "Drop your weapon, seal. The one I know you have. Slowly. Kick it over here." From the stacks, Ethan's voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "This is the FBI. You are surrounded. Release the hostage." "You have 10 seconds, the ghost yelled back. 10 seconds or the girl and the librarian die." Jax looked at Alara. Her eyes were wide, terrified, but he saw it. The spark of resolve he had drilled into her. She wasn't panicking. She was waiting. "All right," Jax said, his hands up. He slowly reached under his jacket, his fingers drawing his primary sidearm, a Sig Sauer, from its holster. He placed it, carefully, deliberately, on the wood floor. "Kick it." Jax slid the pistol across the polished floor. It spun, coming to a rest near the ghost's feet. That was the moment. The ghost, a professional, but a professional with an ego, made the mistake. He believed he had won. He glanced down for a half-second, a microsecond, at the prize on the floor. It was all Jax needed. He didn't shout. He didn't yell. He hissed one sharp, sibilant word, "Jetzt." It was a sound not meant for human ears. Under the desk, Ragnar erupted. He wasn't a dog, he was a force of nature. He launched from the shadows, a 90-pound blur of fur and muscle, ignoring the hostage, ignoring the man's body, his training laser-focused on the single greatest threat, the weapon. He launched himself into the air, his powerful jaws clamping down on the ghost's entire right forearm, the one holding the gun. The sound wasn't a growl. It was a crack. The wet, sickening snap of an ulna bone. The ghost screamed, a high, agonized sound of pure pain. The gun went off. A deafening blast in the small glass room. The round went wild, shattering a display case. But Jax was already moving. As the ghost's arm broke, as his concentration shattered, Jax didn't go for the gun on the floor. He lunged forward, his left hand grabbing Alara, pulling her down to the ground behind him while his right hand blurred to his ankle. He drew his secondary weapon, a smaller, deeply concealed pistol, in a single, fluid, practiced motion. The ghost, his arm useless, his face a mask of shocked pain, tried to bring his weapon back to bear. He was too slow. Jax was on him. 2 precise shots, a controlled pair, center mass. Thump, thump. The sound almost lost in the ringing of the gunshot. The ghost crumpled, his eyes wide, the surprise of his own death the last thing he ever registered. The room was instantly, violently silent, except for the shriek of the fire alarm and the muffled shouts of the FBI outside. Jax was on one knee, his backup weapon now aimed at the door, his body a living shield over Alara. The bagman Finch was sobbing under the table. And Ragnar, his job done, released his jaw, his teeth and muzzle bloody. He stood over the ghost's body, a silent, panting guardian, his tail perfectly still. The door burst open, and Ethan Cole stormed in, his own weapon drawn, flanked by 3 tactical agents. "Jax! Alara! Status. We're secure. Jax yelled, getting to his feet, pulling a shaking, gasping Alara up with him. Ethan took in the scene, the dead professional, the crying bagman, the shattered glass, and the K9, now sitting calmly beside his handler as if waiting for the next command. Jax, his face grim, holstered his backup weapon. He looked at Alara, who was staring at him, her eyes wide with a new, terrifying awe. He had just saved her life again, and he had done it with the cold, lethal precision of a man who knew the high, terrible cost of action. The world came back in a muffled, painful rush, the high-pitched shriek of the fire alarm, distant shouting, the heavy thump of tactical boots on library carpet. Ethan Cole was in the room, his weapon sweeping the scene, his face a mask of fury, relief, and awe. "We're clear," Jax yelled, his voice cutting through the ringing in Alara's ears. He was still a shield, his body positioned between her and the door, his backup weapon held low and ready. "Jax, get her out of here," Ethan ordered, his voice trembling with adrenaline. "My team will handle this. Take the south stairwell now." Jax didn't argue. He holstered his weapon, took Alara's arm, not gently, but with a firm, proprietary grip that anchored her to reality, and pulled her toward the staff door. Ragnar, Fuss, Heel. The retreat was a blur. They moved through the sterile white corridors of the library staff area, down a concrete stairwell. Ragnar, a silent gray shadow at their heels. The sounds of the chaos faded above them. They emerged into the bright, indifferent sunlight of a downtown afternoon. A black, unmarked FBI vehicle was waiting. Jax opened the back door, pushed Alara in, and climbed in after her. Ragnar jumped in last, taking a guard position by the window. The car pulled from the curb just as the first sirens of the next wave of emergency services began to wail. Alara sat, her hands folded in her lap, her entire body vibrating as if the gunshots were still echoing inside her. She was covered in dust and the faint, coppery smell of what had happened. She looked at Jax. He was not looking at her. He was scanning the streets, the intersections, the rooftops, his eyes never resting. He was still the wall. He had not stood down. He would not stand down until she was safe. The weeks that followed were a cold, sterile procedure. The case, as Ethan Cole explained later, wasn't just broken. It was shattered. The ghost was a phantom, a high-level enforcer for the cartel. His death on U.S. soil in a public library created an international incident. The bagman Finch told them everything he knew, and Director Richard Sterling, his last desperate gambit having failed so spectacularly, was arrested in his corner office overlooking the shipping hub. He tried to fight it, but the evidence Caleb Vance had gathered, the evidence that had cost Alara everything, was finally located, not in a house, but in a secure, anonymous cloud server, the key a simple phrase from a card Caleb had given her. It was all there, the smuggling routes, the bank accounts, the names. "It's over, Alara," Ethan told her 2 weeks later, sitting in a bland conference room at the FBI field office. "Sterling is facing a grand jury. The cartel's U.S. operations are cut in half. You are officially no longer a person of interest. You're safe." "Safe?" Alara repeated. The word felt foreign, like a language she no longer spoke. Jax had been gone since that day in the library. He had delivered her to the FBI, filed his report, and disappeared back into the closed world of naval special warfare. His leave was officially over. The sterile safe house was exchanged for a new, temporary apartment, this one paid for by FBI Victim Services. Alara returned to the house on Vista Ridge Trail only once, with 2 federal agents as an escort. The broken door was boarded up. The glass was swept away, but the bloodstains remained on the slate floor. The air smelled of stale violence and old grief. She walked out to the backyard to the small patch of turned earth where she and Jax had buried Luna. She stood there for a long time. Then she turned, walked away, and never looked back. She sold the house. 2 months later, the city was turning toward the chill of winter. Alara stood on the balcony of her new apartment. It was a high-rise in the short north, a small, modern box of glass and steel, high above the street noise. It was the antithesis of her old house. It wasn't isolated. It wasn't quiet. It was alive. She had reopened her flower shop, and the smell of eucalyptus and roses clung to her clothes, a welcome replacement for the smell she was trying to forget. A sound came from behind her, the click, click, click of claws on the new hardwood floor. Titan emerged onto the balcony. He was no longer a puppy. At 6 months, he was a 90-pound lean GSD, his sable coat dark, his ears permanently erect. He moved with a new confidence, but there was a ghost in his gait, a slight, almost imperceptible limp in his right rear leg when he was tired, a permanent reminder of the Oak Club. He was not the innocent, goofy puppy she remembered. He was a guardian. He leaned his heavy weight against her leg, his cold nose nudging her hand, his eyes scanning the city below. The phone rang. It was an unknown number. Alara. The voice was flat, unmistakable. It was Jax. Jax, she breathed, her heart seizing. My leave is up, he said, his voice clipped. Operational. We deploy in the morning. Oh, Alara closed her eyes. Are you still in Columbus? A pause. Affirmative. Will you stop by? She asked, her voice small. Titan, he'd like to see you. The line was silent for so long she thought he had hung up. 1 hour, he said. He arrived exactly 1 hour later. He wasn't in uniform. He wore simple jeans and a dark Henley, but he moved with the same contained energy, a weapon at rest. Ragnar was at his side, his leash held in Jax's practiced hand. Titan on the other side of the door let out a low, challenging growl. Titan, sits. Friend, Alara commanded. The dog, wary, obeyed. Alara opened the door. The two massive German shepherds stared at each other. A silent, tense negotiation of alpha males. Ragnar, the trained professional, ignored the younger dog. He swept the apartment. Jax's eyes did the same, checking locks, windows, exits. He looks good, Jax said, nodding at Titan. He's strong. He is, Alara said, stepping aside. Come in. The air in the apartment was thick, charged with everything unsaid. Jax walked to the balcony, Ragnar at his heels. He had something in his hand. This is for him, Jax said, holding out a short, thick rope made of tightly braided jute. A K9 bite toy. He's got drive. He needs a job. It'll focus his energy. He showed her, holding it while Titan, thrilled, tugged. His protective instinct, channeled into a game. Jax's face, for a fraction of a second, almost smiled. He let go. He's a good dog. They stood on the balcony, the city lights spread below them like a field of fallen stars. The silence stretched. Thank you, Alara finally said, her voice catching. Jax, for everything, for him. For me. I was just doing my job, he said, though they both knew it had been more than that. He turned to face her. You're safe now, Alara. Ethan has people keeping an eye on you, but the threat is gone. I know, she said. He checked his watch. I have to go. They walked to the door. The goodbye hung in the air, heavy and awkward. He was a soldier. She was a survivor. They were from two different worlds, bound only by a few, intensely violent days of shared trauma. He reached the threshold. Ragnar stood, his tail rigid, waiting for the command to move. Stay safe, Alara, Jax said, his hand on the door. You too, Jax, she whispered. He turned his back to her to leave. He was a man made for leaving, for moving on to the next threat. Jax. Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him. He froze, his back to her, his hand still on the door. He did not turn around. Titan and I, she said, her voice clear and strong, finding the resolve he had forged in her. We'll be waiting for you to come home. The silence was absolute. He was a Navy SEAL. He lived a life where coming home was a hope, not a guarantee. He could not turn around. He could not make a promise he was not allowed to keep. He stood there for a long, heavy second, his shoulders tense. Then, slowly, he gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture she could see clearly from across the room. It was not a promise. It was an acknowledgement. Ragnar, sensing the unresolved emotion, let out a soft, low huff. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut. The deadbolt engaged. Alara stood in the middle of her new apartment, the silence returned, but this time, it was not empty. She walked to the window, her hand resting on Titan's big, strong head, and watched the lights of the waiting city.